Reader, don't blame me. I was born in the starless night. In the darkness, I saw a shadow and shined a light on it. And now each star in the sky is a word that I placed. Each star a pin on the map of my tongue. To name something is to lift its veil, to drag it from the depths of the cloudy water to the surface. To name something is to know it. I never once wrote a single word out of spite. I wrote a path out of the darkness. I'm sorry to everyone my path cut through, but I named every place I ran into. Every poem I've ever written was not made, it was already there. And this is the way the universe was built. Matter is neither destroyed nor created, just transferred. Every word you say to me, I send back, I set free. The further I tunnel through the dark, the more I understand my life's work is not mine. My tongue, the surface of a lake, the lake, my body of work. You look down into the murkiness, wanting to know its depth, and see your own face staring back.
C'est la nuit. Pluie. Les lumières du cinéma se reflètent par terre. La foule sort, se disperse. Restent deux femmes et un parapluie au coin de la rue.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Poetry to Your Ears podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, one we've been really looking forward to talking to since reading her book that she's been gracious enough to send us early, which is fantastic. We really enjoyed reading it. I know you read it about a month ago, Eloise.
Yes, when I was traveling.
Kimberly Nguyen is a Vietnamese-American poet and the author of I Am Made of War, Flesh and Ghosts in the Stalks. She is originally from Omaha, Nebraska, but currently living in New York City. She is a graduate of Vassar College, where she holds a degree in both English and Russian studies. Additionally, she studied abroad at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. She is a recipient of the Beatrice Daw Brown Prize for Excellence in Poetry and a Best of the Net nomination. And she was a finalist for the Kundiman's 2021 Mentorship Lab Fellowship. She is currently an Emergent Voices Fellow in Poetry at PEN America. She aspires to be a full-time poet and eventually wants to hold an advanced degree in poetry. So, welcome to the podcast, Kim.
Hello.
How is that? So, can you talk a little bit about that at PEN America?
Yeah, so it's actually outdated. I was a PEN America Fellow last year in 2021.
Wow.
They have a program for emerging writers. You apply, or you can apply every single year, and then based upon the merit of your writing sample and then a couple of your recommenders, they selected five poets, and then a certain number of fiction and creative nonfiction fellows. So we are a cohort of about 15.
How long have you been writing poetry for?
I've been writing poetry ever since, I want to say, the 6th grade. Before that, I started out in short story writing because that's what you read as a kid. There's not really a lot of kids poets out there, and the only thing that's out there that's basically poetry is Dr. Seuss, and that wasn't necessarily what I was interested in. But I think, around the 6th grade, I started reading Shel Silverstein, and then I wanted to kind of try my hand at poetry. So obviously the poems that I wrote in the 6th grade were garbage, but that's where I got started.
Yeah, have you reread them recently?
They are in, because
special box.
I don't know. I was born on the edge of the digital age, so we didn't have Microsoft. Not everybody had Microsoft Word yet. Not everybody had a computer yet. So they're all in these little notebooks that are probably somewhere at home, or my dad probably threw them away, not knowing what they are. So I'm afraid to look at them. I don't want to see them. I hope no one ever finds them.
Yeah. And when did you publish your first poetry collection then?
I actually published a mini digital chapbook my freshman year of college. I had taken this class, and part of our end of the year portfolio was to kind of compile anything. It could be creative, it could be an essay, just kind of a capstone that summarized our experience of the class. And I had chosen to do this multimedia combination of photography, which is what I was interested in also at the time, and poetry together. So it kind of was my beginning, kind of thinking about visual poetry. So I published a digital thing online.
And what was your BA then?
I got a BA in English and Russian studies at Vassar. The Russian was an accident.
It was just coincidental. Yeah, and so I should mention that you have a book coming out. Your next collection's coming out on October the 18th, is that right?
17th, yeah.
17th, October 17th. And like I said, we've been privileged to have some early access to it, and we've really enjoyed. What factors are most important in your work, do you feel?
I think 100% the most important factor is self. Even though I'm writing about all of these other different facets of my life, my family, familial expectations, kind of this larger cultural context, at the center of it is myself and my experience in that. And without my experience, like, none of these poems really exist. They're just basically like essays about, large cultural context. But I think these poems like make these things very, very real.
And I noted in one of your kind of introductory poems, where you kind of say, let me begin by washing my hands, which is almost kind of like a disclaimer from the start. And in that you say, I'm paraphrasing you, but I get the impression that what you're saying is you feel like you're more like a conduit for the universe. You're kind of you talk about yourself as atoms, and that you've traveled billions of years to get here, and that maybe you don't think of yourself so much as writing. You think of yourself as, like I said, being a conduit for the universe to communicate. Is that a bit too dramatic? Am I going a bit too far in saying that?
First of all, I'm a very dramatic person. You saw the intensity of my book description, probably the intensity of the poems, and how dramatic I am in the poems. But the impetus for that poem is, as I was putting the collection together, I realized that there were a lot of people who are going to be very upset by these poems because they don't look very good in some of these poems. I think specifically my parents, sorry, mom and dad, or other people in my family who are tangential to this collection. But I really wanted to make this bold declaration for myself to say, I'm not writing these things to be spiteful. I'm not writing these things, to hurt anybody. I'm writing these things because, once upon a time, something happened to me and I'm just relaying it back. So it's almost very cyclical or circular. It's coming, if you are hurt by these poems, then it's coming back to you. It's leaving me and coming back to you. And so I wash my hands of this pain or trauma that you'll experience, while reading these poems. Not my fault. You started it.
Yeah. I think it's definitely something that is very hard when you publish and you write poetry, and you want to be truthful to yourself, but also people are going to read it and they're going to recognize themselves, and if it doesn't portray an image that's flattering to them, it can be hard to receive. So yeah, it's kind of maybe a dedication to truth, and to say this is your truth.
And it's funny because I remember when Eloise wrote a poem, and her father read the poem, he was kind of, oh my God, are you okay? We need to do something. And it's not the case that you always feel that intense every moment of your life. It's that you felt that intense at that moment. You felt like it was a deeper truth in your history, in your story, in your past. We don't always feel on the edge.
Yeah, and it's also dramatizing this own truth as well, right?
And that kind of so that kind of ties into what we wanted to ask you about, which is you do fantastic stuff with layout and form of words in your poetry collection. you really explore and like to play with form of layout. And so, for example, something that Eloise really wanted to make sure we asked you about was this concept of almost like a single word poem, or the title is the poem, and then you have a footnote that kind of elaborates massively upon this single word or couple words. So, and I'm not, sure how to pronounce, but I believe it's con achua.
Oh, yeah, going to, which is Vietnamese for "have you eaten yet?"
Yeah. So this poem is a phone call from your mum, and I gather this is something she asks you quite often.
Yeah.
And then
every single time.
And then the poem is just a single yes in English. And then of course the bigger point is that it's elaborated in the footnote. And so what gave you this idea to write a poem in this way? What's the footnote represent to you?
Yeah, so I was really playing a lot with the footnote poem in this collection, specifically because I feel like almost poems are physical manifestations of the interiority of the poet. And so as I'm laying things out on the page, I'm thinking of the actual page as center stage, but then all of these footnotes are kind of happening behind the scenes, or they're happening in the background, and the only thing that's actually visible or happening on stage is what's not in the footnote, so the main text. But I think what's happening backstage, or under the covers, is kind of more important in these poems, and you can see how much more important, and also the fact that they take up way more space than the actual action apparently that's happening on center stage. And I think this comes to represent different things. In that particular poem, it represents kind of this underneath layer of all these things that I want to say, but I never do, and how that takes up way more space than the things that I actually want to say. In the series of, On Being Chi, which is about being an eldest daughter, the footnote space kind of functions as the invisible labor that's happening, as an eldest daughter, and how, only the fact that I'm an eldest daughter is happening on center stage, but behind the scenes is all of this labor and this pain and this trauma that I have to carry. And again, that takes up more space on the page than the actual center stage action.
Would you like to read one of these poems?
Yeah. Let me find maybe a favorite. I'm gonna read On Being Chi, verse 2. And the eldest daughter of an eldest daughter of an eldest daughter. See also translator. Between motherland, immigrant, new country. By the transitive property, the tongue, a rubber band stretched thin. The daughter, on the phone with the insurance company, ordering the pizza, calling the bank, chasing away the door-to-door evangelists, the cable TV salesman, the first grader, sounding out stock market vocabulary, reading my mother the money section of the Sunday paper. What do I send you to school for? She cries at my faltering syllables. Translate is from the Latin root that means to be carried across. I am sent, a dutiful guard to a watchtower, to discover and pass down in reverse a language neither of us has ever known, to fortify this family for what I can see coming in the tower distance. The hand strikes me, and I do not pay it forward. The words come to me as weapons, and I disassemble them to build homes from the scrap metal. But now, my life is a barren wasteland of haunted houses that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to put back into words.
So is this about your mother or about yourself?
All of the poems are about myself. I think the placement of the footnotes was a little chaotic. I feel like I didn't want to put the footnote in the same space every time, but I also just kind of, stuck them where they made sense to me. And I feel like in this poem, since we're talking about specifically my relationship to my mother, in other poems that are in this series, I might be talking about things like in a broader context or just about myself. I just felt like the footnote being at the second generation, which would be my mother, was appropriate.
Mm.
Yeah, it's great. It makes sense. It works really well.
Mm.
And then, so that's the kind of leitmotif that plays out.
Yeah, how come you decided to put the series across the poetry collection, across the book, to spread them out?
Yeah, so I feel like in general the collection moves from kind of a lot of pain to kind of this like redemption arc at the end, or maybe not a redemption arc, but the possibility of there being a future without carrying this pain. And so I wanted to disperse this series kind of across the collection so that you're not experiencing all of these poems sequentially or in a row. Because I think that would have been, too intense on the reader, and then by the end, you would have just forgotten that this whole thing happened if we just kind of condensed them.
Yeah, I think it really gives this sense of like a cyclical, thought that keeps happening, and as it says in the description, like the past and the present kind of meddle. Do you think this book is different from your previous books?
Oh, 100%. I feel like my previous work really... Well, my previous work also had different interests. Ghosts in the Stalks, I had an interest kind of in linguistics and tracing trauma back to its roots, like through linguistics. Specifically because Vietnam has been colonized so many times that when you try to trace the etymology of like certain words, you kind of run into this mess where you don't know sometimes specifically like which colonization these like words came from. And so there's kind of that like melding there. And so that was my primary interest in the previous collection. But for this one, I was really interested kind of in the relationship between space and time. Because for me, time couldn't be linear. And I think I kind of allude to this like in the book description, because for me, if time is linear, then a trauma that happens in the past remains in the past, and then time moves on from it. But the fact that like intergenerational trauma continues to persist, my theory was that like a trauma in the past is like a nail that snags on the fabric of like space and time, and then time continues to wrap itself around that nail. And the process of healing is to actually, unravel all of that time from that nail, which means healing not only the past, but also the present, and then therefore the future.
Do you mind if we read your Autopsy of War poem? It's really struck me as something that kind of is talking about what you're talking about there, which is kind of a past trauma that continues. So this is Autopsy of War.
Autopsy of War. War, I am trying to run from you. I burn sage trying to banish you, but the smoke curdles at the sight of you. I went to therapy and laid on the operating table. When my therapist opened me up, she saw tobacco stains on all my organs. We rummaged for a part of me you hadn't smoked out. We diffused landmines you had buried and forgotten, and all that remained of me was a skeleton. I put my organs in jars on a shelf, and I walk past them every morning. What is grief but a body that cannot be laid to rest, jars on life support? What is grief but the cruelty dust buries everything I cannot bear to? War, I am because you were. Who am I if you are not? You have beaten all of my utterances into ghost notes, but I can't play songs without them. Will I always be a placeholder for silence? Will I always be bones collecting dust? War, to throw the jars away, I must begin to acknowledge their loss. I must perform my own autopsy. I don't want to keep my organs here, but I don't want to let my organs go. What I want is whole organs, undamaged organs. Grief is not the needle sewing my hollow body back up, but each stitch I keep ripping out. War, you are my cause of death, and if I am a ghost of you, then I am my cause of death. Whose fault is that but mine? Whose fault is that but yours?
How do you find the images to describe the idea you want to describe?
That's a good question. I think that when I'm writing, often these other images come to me first, kind of images that may be cliche or ones that I've used before. But I think when I go back to edit, what I'm really looking for is like fresh language, fresh images, kind of a new way to describe something that's almost undescribable. And so I feel like it's almost like a little dreamscape that's happening. And I allow myself into a headspace where anything is possible. We kind of, drop down the rabbit hole into sort of this Alice in Wonderland like, headspace. And allowing myself to kind of take any image that comes to me and follow that image to its logical conclusion kind of allows me to attach all of these like different images together, if that makes sense.
So what does the image of organs represent to you in this poem? It's very what your choice of this as a kind of metaphor.
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, I think we're all kind of these hollow flesh bodies that are filled with organs. And so I think organs are not only essential to our life, because what are we without these organs, but they also kind of, because they're so essential, kind of contribute to sort of an identity. And I think in this particular poem, I feel like my identity has kind of been smoked out. I'm not really sure what's in there. It feels a little bit damaged. And so the process of like hollowing myself out, not only is it a loss of something that I really can't name, but it's also, I think, an opportunity to start over and build from scratch new organs with new organs.
It's, in your poem you say, war, I am because you were. Who am I if not? Do you feel that, it's kind of a strange thing to credit, something which is like catastrophic for creation, do you feel that? Do you feel that you exist because of the war's consequences?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is my parents would not have met, actually, if not for the war. They were both from very different parts of Vietnam. My dad was from this farming village in the south of Vietnam, and my mom was from, a major city. And they never would have met in any other context. But they met because they both left Vietnam at the same time, and they ended up in the same, like, refugee detention center in either Cambodia or Thailand. They're not sure because they walked or went by boat, so like there was no Google Maps or whatever at the time. But so yeah, I think that like I have to credit my existence to the war. Like all of these different things happen in order for my parents to meet and then for me to be born. But along with that carries the trauma and the burden of this catastrophic event. Like two people who were very traumatized by this event met and created me, and therefore I carry that trauma from the past.
You were you born in Vietnam or in America?
No, I was born in America.
In Nebraska.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at what point did your parents come to America?
They came, well, my mom came first, because basically in the refugee detention center, what you do is you apply for, asylum, or you apply to be, allowed to enter into different countries. And my dad wanted to come to the United States, but there was a problem with his paperwork. He never had a birth certificate because he was born in this random farming village, and the United States wouldn't process his application without his birth certificate. So my mom was able to come to the United States. She was adopted by this family who lived in Nebraska, which is how we ended up there. I don't think my parents, if they knew what Nebraska or how sparsely populated Nebraska was, they would actively choose to settle there. And then my dad actually went to Canada because they allowed him in, I guess, without his birth certificate. And then my parents kept in touch for a period of time, and then when they got married, my dad moved from Canada to Nebraska, and then they lived there. They still live there. So
that leads me into a poem that I really liked that you wrote, which is Longing for Nebraska.
I have a question before about intergenerational trauma. So, because this is something you explore in your poetry collection, I wanted to know if that's something you explored with your parents too? Is it conversations that you had with them, or is it more of a long journey that you had?
I think that there were attempts to have these conversations with my parents, because my ideal was that we all heal together as a family, and then we're all one big happy family, a little sitcom. But that's unfortunately not what happened, and I think that confronting people with trauma that they don't want to be confronted with or want to handle in any way, or that they think they've gotten over is really difficult. It led to a lot of friction, and at times there wasn't I didn't even have the language to say this is intergenerational trauma, do you see how we're repeating a pattern? Because I had these conversations, I think, in high school, where I was kind of feeling this disruption in our family. I was feeling somehow we were a broken family, but I didn't have words like intergenerational trauma or even trauma, because I was in high school. We didn't talk about these things, and so we would just have these very useless conversations that went nowhere because neither of us had the language to move it anywhere.
Have they read the collection yet?
No, my parents don't read my writing. It's a great blessing and a curse, because I can really write about whatever I want.
I mean, how much do you identify with being a Nebraska native?
I crap on Nebraska a lot, but the truth is I did have a pretty good experience being in Nebraska. I was very close with my family because I struggled to make friends as a kid. I struggled to relate to the other kids, so family was really all that I had, and we had a pretty good time. I'm still very close with my siblings. We call each other very often. And it was a very nice, quiet place to grow up. I think that if I had grown up in a larger metropolitan area, I might have gotten kind of lost in the crowd, but kind of being in the smaller space allowed me kind of a sort of individualism, I think, and space to make my own. I miss Nebraska in a way that I think my friends who are from, major metropolitan areas, they don't understand. They're like, how could you miss a state that has absolutely nothing?
I think maybe what it gives for maybe a poet, what would become later a poet, is you spend a lot of time in your own mind and imagination, and personally, I'm the younger sister of two older sisters, and I had a lot of time on my own, so I was playing with myself and just a lot in my own imagination, or playing with my pets or being outside. So I don't know if you relate to that. Maybe because you had you had younger siblings, maybe you were taking care of them more.
Yeah, but we actually have a very big like age gap, so it wasn't. And the age gap feels so much bigger when you're younger. Like 10 is a big difference from like 5 at that age. Like I think when you're older, like 30 is not that much different from like 25. But just developmentally, like, you know, at that time, it felt like a huge gap. So I often, I think, did feel alone, and I spent a lot of time, you know, like you said, alone in my own imagination. And I started writing because I felt alone, and the page felt like a friend that I could really tell anything to. But I think one of the pros of living in a city is that you find community. You don't have to write alone anymore, which has its own, you know, it also has pros and cons, I think.
Is it something that you found in New York?
Yeah, we have like all of these different like writer groups in New York, organizations that are just dedicated to creative writing or creating space for Asian American writers who might have grown up in spaces where they might have been misunderstood or didn't have like that sort of community. So it's been nice finding that community. In the pandemic specifically, when all writers were forced online, you know, we started creating mini like Twitter communities. So it's been very pleasant actually finding out that I don't always have to write alone.
Yeah.
I think we're all looking forward to Longing for Nebraska now.
Longing for Nebraska. I point across the ocean. I name it home. My mother spins me around. That's not your home. My finger falls on a burning field. There, that's home. So I must live in a house of ash then. Once I came to school covered in ash, and my teacher brushed me off. I am always asked to take the high road that I must build myself, and now I'm here alone. I just want to live somewhere where I can be prom queen. I want a home where I can cover myself in glitter. I am trying to teach my mother the word salvageable. Like how nothing in this home is salvageable. We've gathered all the pieces we want to save into urns. They just become new vessels for our grief. Forgive me. I left out of spite, not for the place, but for myself. I could not perform miracles. I tried, and the ash remained ash. I prayed, but could not return to my original state. I am always trying to return everything to its original state. Return ash to itself before the flames. I am tracing lineage back to the sea where the line breaks. My life has transformed beyond the threshold my 2 hands can carry it back to. Believe me when I say I never leave any place just to leave it. When I say I am trying to return to the ash, to build for these floating remains flesh bodies. But the past denies itself the present. I build a body and get an urn. I am up to my chest in cold porcelain, and I feel it too, my bones, on their way to fire. My skin, in the next life, an urn, a new vessel. I see my body from a distance, an unceasing transfiguration. By the fire, we are changed beyond recognition. Flame, a doorway I have walked through and can't return to. In the frame, I see my body from a distance, a kiln firing up.
And it's fantastic, and it's a great example of what you can say in poetry that, you know, if you just say straight in prose or speech, doesn't do justice to the depth and power of emotions that you have.
I really like the line, I never leave any place just to leave it, when I say I am trying to return to the ash. And then, does it go on after? Yeah. What do you mean by return to the ash?
Yeah, so I think the narrative arc of this poem is that, you know, Nebraska is this place that's on fire for me. and that I left it not because like I hated the place or that I wanted to be spiteful or I hated the people there, but because like I was burning, I was on fire, and I needed to kind of step away from that pain. But there's also, I think, the pain in the poem of not being able to return, of looking back at the place and realizing that the best decision for me was to leave. The best decision for me was not to be there, but also missing that place, missing the things that I grew up around, missing my family. And so I think the poem kind of explores that tension. And also these like images of flame and like a kiln firing up. It's like kind of this metamorphosis too of also, because I left, I am changed, and that's part of the reason now why I can't return.
It's a big it's an important theme in your work, is fire and flame. What does that mean to you? Like for example, the collection is called "Here I Am, Burn Me," right? What does fire represent to you in your work?
I think the fire represents a lot of different things. Specifically, "Here I Am, Burn Me," I'm thinking of like martyrdom. I went to Catholic school for like 10 years, and a story that always really stuck out to me are all these people who were so like enlivened by their faith that they chose to die by fire. Or there's even like the phrase like baptism by fire, which I can't remember exactly what that means, but things like that always really stuck with
it kind of
me.
means to be thrown into something, right? Like your first day at work is a really difficult day. You start like straight in there, thrown right in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also fire kind of has this like transitive property that other elements don't really have. Like you can bury something, but you unbury it, it's pretty much the same unless it's like decomposed over time. You put something in water, like it just gets wet usually. But you put something in a fire, like it becomes transformed automatically, like whether you like it or not. There's nothing that really goes into a flame that comes out like unscathed.
Yeah, and like we touched upon before, this idea of that like nothing is lost, that these atoms have traveled throughout billions of years from the Big Bang. You talk about this. It's this kind of scientific way of looking at the universe kind of plays a part in your poetry as well, right? In the way that you're thinking about these things.
Yeah, it really allows me to think of my life not as God spiting me. Like, I think the tendency when we have like difficult lives, we go through these difficult situations, you're like, yeah, someone up there really hates me. But rather to think of it as kind of an inevitability. Like I had to lead this difficult life, but I also have, I think, the power to change it so that the next iteration of me doesn't have to live the same difficult life, and that for that person is of course how it had to happen.
When you say "Here I am, burn me," is it the reader who burns you, who changes you? What is it, the process of writing?
I think it's the reader, because like I felt a sense of vulnerability when I was writing these poems and when I was putting these poems out. And recognizing that when you write something, it kind of takes its own life outside of you. You can intend so much for it to be one thing, but your reader's just going to take it and run with it in ways that you might not have anticipated or wanted. And I think I really addressed that in "Here I Am, Burn Me," and I'm declaring that like I accept this life that my writing can take outside of me, and I accept the consequences for that.
Wow, that's great.
Is
That's
it
really
from
interesting.
experience from your previous book where you had feedback that you didn't expect? Or?
Yeah, I guess. It's kind of a little bit of like experience, seeing other people's experience, and also like my own anxiety, because like I said, I knew that after publishing this collection there were a lot of people that were not going to be very happy. I am going to be a little upset if my coworker or my parents' coworkers like read my collection and then like go to work and be like, hey, did you see what your kid wrote about you? So, and also, you know, when you take these poems out of context, it just looks like I'm writing this like hate collection to my parents, and that's absolutely not true. But I think like a reader could really just run with it and say like, you know, and give textual evidence that I'm just like here crapping on my parents. But I think the collection as a whole attempts to reconcile with them, and without, you know, without that context, it's all lost.
I felt a lot of tenderness towards your mother, you know, in your relationship. It's a complex relationship, but I definitely felt like there was a lot of love in it. And it's, I don't know, there was a lot of truth in that. Do you think it's going to have an impact on your siblings?
The poetry collection, or
Yeah.
My siblings and I have basically been 100% on each other's side since day one. My siblings jokingly also call me their surrogate mother. They send me like a little Mother's Day thing every Mother's Day, which is really cute. I think each of my siblings has their own relationship with my parents, and it's not my responsibility or my right to kind of interrupt that relationship. I think my youngest sister probably has the best relationship with our parents, because I think that makes sense. They learned over the course of like 2 children how to be the best parent to maybe the 3rd kid. So she has, you know, a nicer relationship. Also, because I wore them out, so they don't really fight her on anything anymore. They just let her do what she wants. And my middle sister has kind of this like needy relationship with my parents. I think she does need them a little bit more. She does like, you know, request emotional support a little bit more, and I was just more independent because like in my experience, I didn't get that much like emotional support from my parents. So I think all 3 of us had different parents is what I'm trying to say.
So you think of yourself as a poet, and how is that going in terms of a career or being able to make a living from that? Is that something you aspire to do in the longer term?
Yeah, well, the dream is that I would be able to do poetry full time, because I think the work that needs to happen in order to make poems happen is a full-time experience. The part of writing the poem itself and editing the poem, I think, is only about like 20% of actual, you know, writing poetry. But I think like thinking about the poem, thinking about how to, you know, convey these ideas, thinking about the language, you know, that's 80% of the work. And it's really difficult to do that work when you're distracted by other things. Like I work full time currently at a job. So during like 40 hours of the week, I'm unable to do that thinking work. And then, you know, at the end of the day, my brain's either burned out or, you know, I run out of energy to even do the writing. So in that way, it's like a little bit difficult. So yeah, full-time poetry is the dream. Although the more that I dive into the publishing industry and talk to other poets, the more I get a little nervous, because I don't think anyone's making money out here. Like,
it's such a different world. It's a different skill set, isn't it?
How much space did you have in writing this collection?
Space as far as
in terms of actual time, what you say, if you work a full-time job, it's difficult to think about
like
writing poems. Mental space, yeah.
I had a good, I want to say 2 years.
Would you say it took 2 years to write this collection?
It took, I think, 3. I started writing this collection in like 2019 ish, and then I really started to write this collection in pandemic. Pandemic gave me a lot of time to think about things, to think about my life. It gave me time to like go to therapy. Working from home just kind of cut out like commute time and other times where my headspace wouldn't be there for writing poems. And so the bulk of the work was done during pandemic, and I used to have a routine too, where like every day for a set like 2 hours I would try to do the work, but then I realized that wasn't working for me because my brain doesn't always come up with poems between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. every single night. It kind of is a little bit more chaotic than that.
Like adults. He kind of writes just when you're inspired.
Yeah.
Would you say that's the same way?
Yeah. I get these like little bursts, I think, of inspiration, and I'm like dead for a bit, and then I get another little burst.
How do you
for this
write?
collection,
How do you write? Do you write longhand?
Are you a notebook person or a phone person?
I'm a little bit of both. When I just want to like think about the language and I'm not ready to lay it out, or I'm not ready to commit to a form yet, I think I'm very much a pen and paper person, because I like the experience of writing with a pen and a paper. I think also it forces you to think about things a little bit longer because you have to put it on the page, it's permanent, versus like on a computer you can just like tap delete. But when I'm already like coming into a poem committed to a specific form or like a visual thing that I'm trying to play with, I do like to use a computer because it's a lot easier to lay things out and to see exactly how it's going to look like with typeface.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you. I feel like your layout is very thought out, right? And you do a lot this 3-paragraph line. I wanted to ask you how that comes up. What's the thought process behind this? Is it meant to be read in different orders?
Like I said before, when I personally believe that like poems reflect, or the form of the poem reflects the interiority of the poet. And so when it was coming down to form, I really asked myself, like, what was I feeling in this moment? So for certain poems where kind of the language feels like scattered, I think it was because I was feeling a little bit scatterbrained, or like the poem was coming to me in these little, I call them islands of thought. I think you see the poems where like it's just these lines that are just like tabbed for almost like no reason, but I consider those like my little islands of thought. And then basically the whole page is kind of like the ocean, and then they all relate to each other within the context of that space. For other poems, I felt like a tighter layout was more appropriate, or kind of stuck to, or try to stick to a little bit more traditional forms, because for me, if the form isn't serving a purpose, then there's no need for there to be like any sort of fancy form.
So it kind of speaks to you. You feel it kind of speaks to you in which way it wants to be laid out. It's almost like it communicates to you, like you don't decide yourself to kind of just arbitrarily place it where you want.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel that way, but I go back and I look at these poems, and I make sure that there is a reason why it's laid out that way.
Right.
Because I think one thing that I've learned through my experience is somebody's always going to question your method, and you can't say just because. You have to have like a reason. So as long as there's like a reason that I can think of for using the particular form, I leave it.
You do you perform your poetry live?
No.
Is that something you might want to do in the future? Something that seems terrifying? Something that seems like a good idea?
I think that it's a different skill set,
Yeah.
and one that I don't necessarily have.
You like the idea of being more a published poet, being read rather than heard, maybe?
Yeah, I'm also very introverted. I feel like the worst part for me that I'm, now that I've had this book, is thinking about like the publicity part and the fact that I'm gonna have to like go out and meet people.
Yeah, you're doing a tour though.
Like very awkward. and everybody's gonna know, because like when you're like writing a poem, everyone's like, oh, you're so eloquent, like you must be so graceful, and then like meet me in real life and I'm like, no, I'm a mess.
Yeah, where are you touring?
I'm kind of still in the process of planning my tour, because I procrastinated on that. But I'm kicking off my tour in my hometown, which is really exciting. I'll be touring Omaha area high schools, actually the week of October 17th, which is when the book comes out. So I'll be starting there.
So
My book launch will be...
What do you do on these tours? They're kind of, it's like a press tour.
Yeah, it depends on the audience. For high school specifically, I'm really there to talk about my process, talk about the career path, because I wish that in high school somebody had kind of mentored me a little bit more, rather than me just kind of, screwing around and figuring it out as I went. Yeah, and really kind of like getting youth interested in poetry, because I think that the way poetry is taught in American high schools is really kind of a shame. It's kind of taught as this like puzzle that students need to decipher, and that there's only like one right way to decipher the poems. And I really want these high school students to understand that poetry is really the experience. It's all experience. Like, it doesn't really matter what, your teacher thinks, your neighbor thinks, but like, how did you experience this poem? Like, what did you feel? What did this poem attempt to make you feel? That's really where I want to kind of uplift poetry to high school students.
Yeah, and the poetry can be something that they can relate to from their own personal experience as well. It doesn't always have to be great romance poetry. It doesn't have to be about war even. It can be about everyday experience.
I think that's the common theme of our podcast, is no one liked poetry in school.
Kind of, yeah. So just to say thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. And thank you so much for providing us with a copy. We're really going to enjoy this, and we're looking forward to getting a physical copy at some point. Where can we get a physical copy in the future? We'd love to have it in our collection.
I recently started shipping to like 5 other countries, including the UK, Australia, Vietnam, on my website, but unfortunately the shipping costs are significant. I have not figured out international distribution, so I will get back to you on that.
And otherwise we can follow you on Instagram and Twitter, right? What's your username?
It's Kwin Poetry.
Great, yeah. And you're quite active on there as well. Do you engage with your followers on there?
I try to, because I feel like this is the age of social media, and if you're a writer, you're trying to be anyone, and you're not on social media, you're kind of falling behind. It's a blessing and a curse.
Great. So good luck for your tour.
Yeah,
and,
we wish
we
you the
look
best
forward
publication. We really enjoyed reading it and talking to you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Secoue ses cheveux. De l'autre côté de la rue, l'homme les observe, de loin.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can follow us on Instagram at Poetry to Your Ears, and on Twitter at Poetry2 Your Ears. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and any other podcasting station. This podcast is published as a newsletter on Substack, substack.com. We also invite you to help us with a paid subscription, as it will help us to afford transcripts for the podcast to make it more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people, and anyone who would benefit from reading the podcast alongside hearing it. Thank you for your support, and see you next time.